Hey friend, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here listening to another episode of the Pattern Design Circle podcast. Here we talk all about the ins and outs of designing knit and crochet patterns and running a business that makes it all possible. I'm Jessica, your host, knitting pattern designer, design mentor, and the friend in your ear. Can't wait to dive right in. The Pattern Design Circle podcast is sponsored by the Pattern Design Circle, a membership community for knit and crochet pattern designers that are feeling lost, lonely, or frustrated in their business. It connects you with a supportive community that's always eager to answer your questions and help you through the hard times. And there's loads of resources and activities specifically catered to business and designing. Sound like your jam? Check it out at snickerdoodlenits.com/design-circle. That's snickerdoodle, like the cookie, knits, knits.com/design-circle. All right, let's get into it. Welcome back to the Pattern Design Circle podcast. I'm so excited to be here chatting with you, and I'm so glad you came out to hang out with me, so I'm not talking to myself. This episode is actually going to be a little bit different than anything we've done before. So this is a replay of an Instagram live that I held on my Snickerdoodle Knits account on Instagram, talking all about my design story, how I got to be started as a knitting pattern designer, and all of those kind of details. This is actually going to be the first of several design stories that I'm going to be sharing here on the podcast. If you're not familiar, I host an Instagram live every month on my Snickerdoodle Knits account, featuring different designers to tell their design story and to get to know them a bit more as designers, know their process, and their life beyond designing, because we are all humans as designers. We aren't just knitters and designers. We also have other interests. And so that's part of what this design feature designer series is all about. So I'll go ahead and get you started on the chat about me. And then in future episodes, I'll also introduce you to some of the other designers. And I expect that this will continue to be a regular occurrence on the podcast, since it is regular on Instagram. It just feels like it ties in so well on this podcast, talking to designers about their designs and building their businesses and things like that. So hope you find it really inspirational. If you like it, let me know. Go ahead and send me a message at Pattern Design Circle or at Snickerdoodle Knits on Instagram. And I'll let you get into it. Enjoy. Hello and welcome. This chat is something a little bit different. Due to some requests that I've had, I am going to be talking all about my design journey, my process as a designer, how I got into designing, all of that. So I figure I'll go ahead and start with a chronological timeline, because the first question was, how did I start designing? And then there are some other questions that kind of dive deeper into some of my background of how I got here. So if you have any questions while we're chatting, of course, leave those in the comments. Whether you're watching live or watching the replay. Thanks for everybody for hopping on. It's fun to see you. So like I was saying, this is a different kind of video. Folks have been asking about my design journey and how I got here. So backpedaling to back when I first learned to knit. I was late elementary, middle school age, when the first person, a family friend, first taught me how to knit. She was teaching me with dishcloths. Definitely totally forgot how to do all of that. Another family friend, a few years later, I figured that I must have actually learned like that second time in middle school. So the first time was probably sometime in elementary. And so I was maybe 12-ish the second time I learned how to knit. And I must have done some scarves or something. But I never was like a super consistent knitter. It wasn't like a thing that I was doing all of the time. I definitely had through high school times where I kind of retaught myself to knit either through YouTube videos, or I had a book with knitting patterns that I'd gotten on clearance from Hastings. And it had like some of the pictures of like how to do a knit stitch, how to do a purl stitch. And so I tried to learn from that, but I found it really difficult to learn from books. I learn a lot easier from videos, watching other people actually doing it and figuring out how to follow them. So that's how I first learned how to knit. And then I did sell some scarves and stuff, you know, like the ruffle scarves that were really popular in the 2012-ish. So I had done quite a few of those in high school and sold them to folks that were interested either at school, or my mom is a preschool teacher, so she had a bunch of coworkers buying them. So that was kind of my first little dabble in selling knits. Definitely didn't expect it to become anything bigger than that. It was just kind of a thing that I was enjoying. Other people were like, hey, will you make me one? And so I sold like 20 of them. And then I didn't do much knitting through college. In my high school years, I had started a project from that book, and it took me like 5 or 6 years to finish it. It was a scarf, and it felt so difficult. Must have just been like working stitches together and everything, but every time I picked it up, I couldn't remember the difference between a knit and a purl. It felt like such a struggle. So once I finally finished that project, I kind of like felt like I could do anything in the knitting world. Like I had the confidence, like, okay, I finally was able to figure out this project and get it finished. I can probably figure out anything else. Which of course I had no idea what else was in the knitting world, but that was kind of a pivotal moment in my knitting confidence, just realizing like, hey, I can get this figured out. So through college, I was an architectural engineering major. I didn't have a whole lot of time for anything, but I went to school in Wyoming, Laramie, Wyoming, tiny town, and over the summers, 2 summers, we went down to Denver, Colorado for internships. I was married in college, so yeah, a couple years into college. So we had 2 summers where we went down to Denver for internships. And while I was there, I met Rachel of 6 and 7 Fiber. I first met her as just a friend, and then I discovered that she was a yarn dyer and discovered what that meant. And I really knew nothing about hand-dyed yarn. Growing up, there was a yarn shop that I had been to a couple of times besides like Michael's and Joann's. Michael's was the main place that I shopped for most of my knitting stuff up until just the last couple of years. But there was a yarn shop there, and I remember it had expensive yarn that was way outside of my budget, but I didn't realize at all that there was hand-dyed yarns and that there were indie pattern designers or anything like that. So meeting Rachel really opened up all of that to me. That's when I discovered there was this whole online knitting community, and all of that. So that must have been summer of 2017 when I first met Rachel, I think. And so I got into knitting again on my next winter break. So that would have been like December 2017. I decided my brother was getting married. We were going up to stay in a hotel, and we were gonna have quite a bit of time in the hotel and a lot of time driving, of course. And so I kind of had this habit of, over my winter breaks, I would focus on like one kind of hobby because I have so many different hobbies and interests. I've kind of just focused on one hobby over the winter break. And so I decided that winter break I would make knitting my thing that I did. So I decided I wanted to try making a cabled headband, and I was sure it was gonna be so hard, but I really wanted to try it and give it a try. So
I did. I started making cable headbands and I totally fell in love with cables. Absolutely loved it. Was so surprised that it wasn't nearly as difficult as I expected it to be. And so that is kind of how I got into knitting more seriously. After that, I started knitting through the school year more. I found that it made it feel like I was able to be more like I found it like it felt like I was being profitable, so I could squeeze it into a few different areas. But I still didn't do a whole lot that semester, of course, because I was still going to school. I was spending on average 80 to 100 hours per week on school activities, a little bit of work on the side. So I was very busy. And then I graduated in spring of 2018, and we went back down to Denver. That was our second summer in Denver. I was working for not a graphic designer, interior designer. And the job was supposed to be, I was going to work with them in person over the summer, part-time, and then we would transition into full-time and I would work remotely. So we were about 2 hours from Denver. And that was the plan. And my husband still had a year left for his master's degree. So I had finished college. He still had a year left. We were still in Laramie where there's not a lot of job opportunities, but I was going to have this interior design job where I could work remotely, which was great until it didn't actually work out that way. So I got down to Denver, did the interior design job. I really enjoyed it. And it immediately was more than part-time. I was working 60-hour weeks through a lot of the summer. And then we went back to Laramie as planned, and my boss, it was a very small company, so it was like my boss and two other ladies that I was working with, and my boss quickly realized that she does not do well with remote kind of communication, and so suddenly my hours went from 60 hours a week to 10 hours a week. And I had all of this time. So I kind of been playing with this idea, like, what if I were to start a knitting business? What if I were to, like, say, sell knits on Etsy? So I had been doing a bit more knitting during that summer. I had committed to make a blanket for my aunt, which was ridiculous. It was like a whole queen size blanket. And I had no idea what I was getting into. But I basically spent the whole summer doing that because I was going to get her the blanket by the end of the summer. And I did it. And I realized how crazy I kind of am. But so then when my work kind of came to a halt, there weren't really many options available for my interest. And so I decided to go ahead and start an Etsy shop. So I started selling hand knits at craft fairs and on Etsy, and that is how Snickerdoodle Knits started. So I mostly did hats and some headbands, arm knit scarves, things like that. And it was only a couple months into that probably, I was realizing, okay, you've been to Laramie and remember shopping at Cowgirl yarns. Yes, that's so fun. I should have brought my sample. I can tell that story too. So I have some yarn that I got from Cowgirl Yarns that I did a design out of. So just like 2 months into selling Etsy products, I was working with super bulky yarn, having to crank a lot of stuff out pretty quickly. And I realized I can't do this forever. Like, if this is going to be a long-term business thing, it's getting really hard on my body, and I'm getting really bored just making the same thing over and over again. So in my mind, I'm like, there's two different paths. If this whole knitting business thing is going to continue long-term, there are two different paths I can take. I can be an indie dyer, and dye yarns, which sounded fun and enjoyable, but we were in a tiny little, I guess it was a townhouse, but we had, it was a very small kitchen, and living room space and then 2 bedrooms upstairs. And it was just way too cramped to even consider dyeing yarn at all. Plus, I didn't have the finances to invest in equipment and things like that. So second option was like, oh, I could design knitting patterns. But I never felt like I was creative. And that was something somebody else had asked about my transition out of architectural engineering. So just a little bit of background there. I went into architectural engineering being told that I could be an engineer, or I could be an architect, or I could kind of be something in between, doing math and artsy stuff. And I had always been lacked confidence in my creativity and my art skills. And I'd always been good at math. So I was like, okay, this is perfect. I can be creative because I enjoy that work, but I can still do math. Halfway through my career, my college education, they're like, no, you can be an engineer, and that's basically what your degree is. To be an actual architect, you're gonna have to go to grad school for a couple more years, blah, 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 blah. So I finished my degree, but wasn't loving all the engineering stuff. I just needed more creativity, more artsy stuff. It just felt too monotonous and not enough room for creativity there. Engineers will argue with you, say that there's lots of creativity, but it just wasn't the kind of creativity that I wanted and needed. And I was burnt out from school. I was struggling a lot with some mental health stuff. I was having extreme anxiety that was making me physically sick, and so I just couldn't make myself go to school for another 2 to 3 years right after that. So that is why I had my eyes on interior design, because I really love floor plan layouts and decorating and all of that stuff. Anyway, so when I'm considering this whole idea of being a designer, I'm like, I'm not creative. I can't generate ideas. So that's just not going to be an option. So I just continued with the Etsy shop and, figured I kind of was still trying to explore options with interior design, reaching out to just folks that were doing interior design by themselves nearby and trying to make connections, just within a few hours. And I really didn't know what was going to happen. But I thought I would be going into interior design or working in an architectural office, either as kind of like an architectural assistant or as an interior designer. Once we moved, once Eric finished his schooling and we moved to a bigger city. So that's kind of what I had in mind. It's just like, all right, we'll continue this Etsy thing until you have something better. And then, so I started the Etsy shop, officially launched it October 1st of 2018. And then I think it was February. So it would have been like December where I'm like, this isn't going to last forever. In February, I suddenly had a whole bunch of design ideas. So I was sitting in a meeting, and somebody was wearing this scarf that just had these motifs, a lot of triangular motifs and stuff, I think. I don't even really remember what it looked like, but I was sitting in the meeting and suddenly I started having all of these different design ideas that were inspired by this. They didn't look the same, but they used the same kind of like triangle idea. And suddenly I had like 5 different design ideas that I'm sitting there thinking about, and I had to go write down immediately afterwards. And those still have not become actual patterns, but I'm hoping next year they will. The reason, and I can show you the sketches that have, those are some of the other older ones. They've been sitting here since February of 2019, so almost 3 years. This is what made me super excited about designing these ideas. But I was just then gaining familiarity around the whole conversation around race, and also understanding the importance of giving credit where credit's due, and I realized a lot of these designs really feel Native American to me. And so I wanted to, whenever I released them, make it somehow a connection with that, to honor the Native American people, to kind of understand more of their design stuff, and to do it in a very respectful way. So that's the reason these haven't been designed yet. I had started knitting the headband, but anyway, I have some big ideas for what I want to do with them next year, with some collaborations and things like that. So that is how I got started. And then after that, I don't remember if it was the same setting, or at least within the few days after that, I started just jotting down tons and tons and tons of different ideas. And so some of them you might recognize. There was the super simple robed headband is one that was part of that I released then in March of 2020. The With Love from the North mittens was one of those, which was my first design that I officially released. I released them April of 2019. And also Hidden Love mittens, which I don't have a sample of, but it's very similar, but instead of color work, it's a pearl texture here. So that was my first actual design. I then used some of the patterns that I had created for my Etsy shop, just a really simple hat and headband that I released then as patterns. And then I started getting into shawls. So the reason I'm wearing this shawl is because this was the first shawl I ever knit. That was in January of 2019, so just a couple of months before I started designing. And this is the Hipster Shawl by Joji Locatelli. And this is using, remember I mentioned Rachel, 6 and 7 fiber, that introduced me to all of this knitting stuff. This is her yarn. So this is called Bosom Friend, and I don't remember what base it is, but I had decided, so my grandma passed away in December of 2018, and I had decided it would be really neat to make a shawl kind of remembering her. These were some of her favorite colors. She loved pinks and purples, and I do too. And I loved the whole bosom friend idea with it. So I used Rachel's yarn. So this is my first time working with hand-dyed yarn. It was my first shawl. And that also that highly influenced my designing, because then I started to get obsessed with shawls. So I had knit a few more shawls, and then in May, I started designing shawls. So the first one that I had tried was, I had these yarns that I had picked up from Michael's, and I was going to make a shawl with them. I quickly discovered there wasn't nearly enough yarn to make a shawl. So as you can see, it's actually a scarf. And this is obviously not supposed to be worn with a shawl, but that is how that turned out. But as I was solving this issue of, do I have enough yarn for this shawl? How do I make the math work? All of that. One of my friends, Laura at Running on Yarn, who's actually the second person who taught me how to knit, she dyes yarn, and so she offered to send me yarn to make a design. So this is the first shawl that I actually finished and released. This is it's called Dancing in the Rain, but I kind of just took a whole bunch of textures that I really enjoyed knitting, and because of all of the drop stitches, because there's a few different kinds of drop stitches lengths, that was my first shawl design. And then I kind of became known as a bit of a shawl designer because I had lots and lots of shawls after that. I do also have, I had mentioned that this was supposed to be a shawl, and since this didn't become a shawl, I actually got some other yarn and made the actual shawl. So these are the Remembering Summer shawl and scarf, which tell the story of the seed to the blossoms of summer. This like the seed being planted here, and then, or the seeds are just here and then being planted in rows, and then the rain, and then baubles for the sun, which I've actually updated. The baubles look a bit more like this now. And then, let's see, sun, and then they're sprouting and growing in the rows, and then these are the flower blossoms. So that did become a shawl. And then somebody was talking about cowgirl yarns. So we left Laramie in May of 2019 or June of 2019. Before I left, I went to Cowgirl Yarns and I bought myself fancy yarn. It was first time I've spent money on, well, I bought this yarn, but so it was the second time I spent money on nice yarn. And I got Plymouth Yarn Company yarn in a gray and purple speckle and a solid purple. And that is what became my gratitude shawl. So that one was a really special design because I was using a really special to me yarn. It was, to me, it felt like a huge amount of money to pay, even though I had a gift card that paid for half of it. And it's only 2 skeins, but anyway, that is how I started designing. And then of course I've been designing full-time now for, this year will be 3 years. And yeah, so do you have any other questions about my design process, any of that? I'll go through the questions that other folks have already submitted as well. But so the first question that I had gotten a while back that prompted all of this was, how did you start designing? Which that was the long version, over 20 minutes long of that. But I feel like it was really organic. I didn't try to force it when I, started to think about designing. Of course, a lot of that was lack of confidence, thinking there's no way I had the creativity to come up with new design ideas. But once that inspiration hit, it just like started, it really came from something inside of me, I guess. Like, it wasn't forced at all. And I think that was really important. And then it kind of has just become a thing since then. I have, I don't know if I still number all of my designs, all my design ideas, but I have over 120 design ideas in my design notebook. And I've designed 40 patterns. So obviously a majority of those have not become patterns, but yet. So then the other question this person had asked was, what information has been the most useful in your journey? And for me, the most useful information has always been around business and mindset. Growing up, I never wanted to own a business. I wanted to be able to just be niche in what I was interested in, be able to work in my own little corner and have somebody else take care of all of the other sides, because there's so many aspects to business, and here I am. But so I didn't know anything about business before I started thinking about the Etsy shop. I learned tons and tons from just workshops and webinars and email lists and blogs and podcasts. And then I had no idea anything about all of this mindset stuff, which has been really interesting and valuable to me, like considering perfectionism and how that changes the way we show up in the world and the work that we do, and learning that it's okay to be human and to not be perfect. I think the most valuable thing, and this isn't necessarily information somebody has given me, but the most valuable thing for me has been which I talk about a lot, has been just understanding that this is my own journey, understanding who I am as a person, the things that bring me joy, and what my passion is. That's definitely been the most valuable thing to me, is just opening up all of these different things, and realizing the things that light me up, and being able to connect with people. As far as tips that I would give somebody else, I always say it's so important to remember what your passion is and what your reasoning is. So why did you start designing in the first place? Or why did you want to start designing? Because if it's for somebody else, if it's because everybody else is just telling you, oh, you should design, I don't think that will fuel the right kind of passion, in my opinion, at least from my experience, the way that I work. But if it comes from loving the creativity and loving the design process and loving just to create in general, I think that will get you a lot farther, and it will sustain you when things aren't easy and when your patterns aren't selling. So, side note on that, it was, oh, I wish I had the actual stats in front of me. It was over 6 months, and I had only made one pattern sale for $4. And then, you know, like within 9 months, I had still made less than $100 or something. Anyway, I had a very slow start to pattern sales, but I was so excited about what I was creating that it really didn't get me down at all. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but if I didn't have the level of excitement and passion and ideas behind all of it, it definitely, I wouldn't still be here. I mean, I wouldn't still be operating Snickerdoodle Knits. I wouldn't still be designing. So yeah, if you have any other questions about that, or, you know, what kind of tips I have or information about anything, feel free to ask. Somebody else said, was it one big thing that pushed you to quit architectural engineering for this, or a series of small things? I think it really was the not loving engineering work, really needing more creativity, and then the whole realizing the toll it was taking on my mental health to have so much pressure and criticism and all of that induced all of the anxiety and a lot of different things that made me know, okay, I don't want to go into grad school right now. That's really what pushed me away. I was really looking for a creative outlet, I suppose, is probably the main thing. And then, of course, when I didn't have a job, really, that's when Snickerdoodle Knits started. So, and then the last person, and again, if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat. And thanks for everybody who's been hanging out. So the last question was, I want to start designing, but I don't know anything about basics. How did you do it? So this is a big question, and it really depends on where you are and who you are and how you work, in my opinion. I would argue if you know how to knit or crochet, if that's why you're wanting to get into designing, is because you already know how to knit and crochet, you 100% know a lot of stuff. Obviously that's what designs are made of, and you understand, at least to a certain extent, how stitches work together and what they create as far as a design. You understand how to read a pattern. You already, without knowing it, have preferences on how you want a pattern written, things like that. So if you're, it depends what you're stuck with, and that is why I do, for beginner designers, I have one-on-one coaching, because it really allows me to figure out where you're getting stuck and what you need help with. But if you're, I had written some ideas here. So if you're struggling with design ideas, the first place, if you're just struggling to generate design ideas, like you already know that you're really good at all the math and stuff like that, but it's just a matter of getting those ideas created. it actually so happens that Beth of Fig and Filament and I just released a program today where we are sending creative prompts each week. So we send the prompt, we encourage you to think about it and write about it before ever creating design ideas for about half an hour for the whole process. So it's not a matter of, hey, design something that does this. It's more like, think about this thing. How does it make you feel? What do you think of? What stories and memories come to mind? And then organically create a design idea from that. So if you're having trouble creating design ideas, that might be a helpful resource. I also will be posting a blog. It was supposed to be up this week. I haven't written it yet. But on how to generate design ideas. So that might be helpful for you. If you're struggling with the sizing and math aspect of it, my just like really quick tips are reference the Craft Yarn Council guidelines if you aren't already. They have some sizing stuff. Of course, there's not everything there, but it's a good place to start. Do research. There's lots of information on blogs and stuff, and definitely use spreadsheets that will help with your math. But of course, it depends what you're creating. Happy to help, of course, one-on-one if you have specific questions. But those are my general guidelines there. If you're struggling with pattern writing, so you have the design idea, you've maybe even created the sample, but you're struggling to get it written down. My first tip is to pay attention to patterns that you like working from. So pay attention to what layouts you like, how the instructions are written, and start there. And then just start from the beginning. Say cast on how many ever stitches you're casting on, and just write the instructions exactly how you do them. And then if you're struggling with business and marketing, that is a whole thing in itself. There's so much to it as far as understanding your why and your purpose. I think that is extremely valuable and important, because that will guide any of your choices that you make in your design business. Of course, there's understanding your ideal customer, having a marketing plan, Instagram and Pinterest and YouTube and email lists, and deciding where you should be. There's so much to that. So again, I do one-on-one coaching you could do, or the design circle is probably a really good fit if you're already comfortable with the design process, but you're just trying to figure out how to market yourself. We have quite a few guest speakers that have talked about different things, and I'm always happy to answer any questions inside of there. So if that is something that you're needing, there is a link in my bio to join the waitlist. Doors will be opening at the end of this month. So yeah, that was my tips for where to start if you're not sure. If you happen to be on this call, go ahead and continue to ask questions, or if you're watching the replay, put those in the comments. My two big tips for designing in general are never force creativity. I personally don't find that that's ever helpful. I come from a very emotional place, of course, though, and so my designs have a lot of meaning in them, and when it's just forced, it doesn't have the same kind of excitement around it, and it doesn't end up being a design that I love. So I say don't force creativity. I say allow it to work organically. Of course, there are ways that we can encourage that creativity, and ways to help that, but I don't think it's ever helpful to force yourself just to make a pattern. And then my other big thing is, which I've already mentioned, is consider why you want to do this, and really feed on that. Like, understand what is important to you and what's not important to you, what your goals are, what your definition of success is. All of that, I think, is really important. Oh, somebody asked, how did I come up with the name Snickerdoodle Knits? Okay, so of course it started when I was opening the Etsy shop, and I had several different names. Of course, I don't remember those names anymore that I thought that I just loved, and they were either taken on Etsy or on Instagram. And so eventually I came up with Snickerdoodle Knits. Basically what I was trying to create was a warm, cozy vibe that's just like comforting and cuddly, and yeah, so that's I ended up with Snickerdoodle Knits. It's kind of just, to me, I just picture like somebody curled up in their comfy chair or couch or something with a big cozy blanket and some coffee and their Snickerdoodle cookies, or hot chocolate or whatever. And so that's how it started. And when I had shared with Rachel, I was trying to come up with ideas, and I'm like, what do you think of Snickerdoodle Knits? And she's like, oh my goodness, it totally fits you. So that between her thinking that it was a good fit and me really liking it and it being available on the platforms I was interested in, that is how I started the name. And then of course, when I started the Etsy shop, I had done the searches to make sure it wasn't taken. And apparently there was an inactive shop, which if a shop is inactive, it doesn't show up in the searches. There was an inactive shop named Snickerdoodle Knits. And so I still didn't get Snickerdoodle Knits for my Etsy shop name. It's Snickerdoodle Knits Co. But at that point I had already put enough work into getting a name and settling on it that I decided I could settle with the Snickerdoodle Knits Co. Does anybody else have any other questions? That was my design story, a bit about my design process. My process is I pretty much always have a concept theme in mind beforehand, and then I use those themes to create, or like I usually kind of think about the emotions around those things and then think about what I want the finished project to feel like, or why somebody would want to wear it. And from there I choose yarns and colors and stitches. So that's not always the case. Sometimes in my design idea book I do have a few designs that are based off stitch motifs. Like if I'm going through a stitch dictionary, I'd be like, oh, that would be really cool as a cowl with this other thing. But for the most part, that's how my process works. But are there any other questions here? Any other questions about designing in general? I can give it just a couple of seconds. And of course, for anybody that's watching the replay, go ahead and leave comments too. I'm always happy to chat. And this was fun. I hope this answered the questions for the folks that submitted them, and maybe give you a little more insight on my design journey, how I got here, why I got here. It's one of those things where like I never would have seen myself here, say 10 years ago, but now looking back, it makes sense. It's like I've always had a love for crafts, sewing and knitting and stamping and scrapbooking and all that stuff from the time I was really little. Latch hooking, and I've just dabbled in so many different crafts. And I've always wanted to be like artistic and creative, but I've always struggled with I also haven't taken a lot of classes, but I struggle with getting those ideas out with my hand. So like anything with sketches or painting or anything, would get really frustrated with, and so because of that I always felt like I wasn't creative. But this has shown me I do have ideas. I do have some sort of form of creativity in me, and it was just a matter of figuring out what worked well for me and the best way to kind of transform those ideas. So it's been a really fun journey for, now it's been over 3 years since I first started Snickerdoodle Knits, and so excited that I have pushed through all of the times that I've had doubts and wondered, should I go back and get a real job, or what should I be doing? Because I just absolutely love this. And of course, last year I realized that I absolutely love working with designers, whether that's collaborations or talking about business and design and helping them find clarity in their work, all of that kind of stuff. It just lights me up so much. So I'm really excited about what the future has, both for designing and for things like the design circle and stuff like that. So thanks so much for those of you that joined, those of you that submitted questions, and for listening through this whole spiel. And thanks so much for your support on my journey. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And again, if you have any questions at all, you're always welcome to DM me, just send me a message or comment on the replay of this video or anything like that. But have a wonderful afternoon. Wow, thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you found it valuable, please share the podcast with a designer friend. And if you have a minute, leave a review. It's so helpful for me and means the world to me. Chat soon.